Elizabeth's voice sounded out, sweet but as icy as ice, making its way through the pleasant atmosphere of the party that was illuminated by the golden glow of the lights. "Robert, everyone," Elizabeth's voice rang out. She rose to her feet and raised her glass, her eyes appearing both resolute and bright. It was impossible for anybody to have predicted that such remarks would reverberate in this enchanting environment, which featured a table covered in white silk, red roses arranged in the shape of a heart, and the background sound of lively laughter. "I would like to talk about something." She took a little pause, her eyes moving over each woman's confused face. "I am seeking a divorce. I need a new life, a new beginning, and freedom," I said. Suddenly, there was complete silence in the room, as if someone had stifled every sound. There was a sudden cessation in the faint clinking sound of cutlery. I was the recipient of stunned glances that flew toward me and then back to Elizabeth, as if they were waiting for an explosive reaction, an outburst of rage, a shout, or at least a glass of wine that was thrown across the hallway. But all I did was stand there, unruffled and silent. I, Robert Grayson, am 53 years old, and I was aware that this particular time was going to arrive. Actually, I had been getting ready for it for a considerable amount of time. While I was holding the glass of red wine in my hand, it began to shake slightly. This was not because I was angry. Rather, it was because the time had finally come for me to be free. Just out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of my younger brother, Ethan, seated at the table in the vicinity. Due to the fact that his hand was holding his glass so tightly, his knuckles were white. He avoided looking at me, but I didn't have to look to know what he was doing. I was always aware of that. The brother I had carried through years of adversity, the one I trusted as my own flesh and blood, turned out to be the one who silently sank the deepest dagger into my back. Ethan and Elizabeth were the ones who did it. In addition, they decided to expose everything today, which is the very same night that we are celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary. However, I did not become angry. It was unnecessary for me to do so. The only smile I showed was a slight one that was composed, intentional, and just enough to cause people who knew me to tremble. In a low voice that reverberated around the quiet room, I remarked to Elizabeth, "I am grateful that you are being upfront with me." Taking my time, I carefully removed a gray envelope from the pocket of my suit and gently placed it in her palm. "You might read this at a later time. There is no need to hurry." She blinked, her palm becoming icier on the envelope, and a glimmer of worry flashed over her gaze. Because he was trying to conceal his worry, Ethan bent his head. I glanced across at the visitors, who were still staring at me in utter disbelief. Especially Daniel, my son. "I would want to thank you all for attending." Taking a look at the young man, I clarified that I was referring to the 24-year-old man who had recently been promoted and was sitting there with a pale face. "Dear Daniel, I am so proud of you. Extremely proud with myself." Afterward, I left the room, neither swiftly nor slowly at all. Every step was deliberate, as if I were leaving a typical party rather than the location where my entire life had just been shattered into millions of pieces. It seemed as if Elizabeth and Ethan were following me with their eyes, which were as piercing as arrows, but they were unable to touch me. Not at this time. I went outside and felt the chilly night air on my face. Although I was standing on the sidewalk, I took a deep breath and allowed the aroma of flowers that bloomed at night to combine with the searing hatred that was building up in my chest. The secret texts, the glances between them, and the occasions when Elizabeth was occupied with late meetings when she was actually with Ethan were all signs that we were about to do something. I had seen this coming months ago. No, I'm not a loser. I have never been a fool in my life. Is that envelope gray in color? It was the first move in the game. On the inside was the petition for divorce, which had been painstakingly prepared by my attorney on the basis of the prenuptial agreement that Elizabeth had signed 25 years earlier. That provision about infidelity. She would be unable to win anything. Compared to me, she placed a higher value on the house, the assets, and even the reputation. Upon entering the vehicle, I shut the door and uttered the following words to myself. "Elizabeth, Ethan, you believe you have triumphed. This game, however, it is I who is in possession of the parts. As I navigated my way through the crowded streets, I encountered neon lights that appeared to be thin, hazy trails of light as they passed the glass. My heart continued to beat, but it was not because of any discomfort. On the contrary, the wrath that I felt within me did not boil over like a fire. It was icy, pointed, and honed to the point that it looked like a blade that I had been honing for months. It was Elizabeth and Ethan who believed they had triumphed over me, but they were unaware that I had witnessed everything a very long time before, and I had readied myself. Not that I'm the sort to be jealous. Over the course of our 25 years of marriage, I had acquired the ability to trust Elizabeth, even when she became emotionally distant and when her smiles became artificial. A minor fact, however, jolted me up around half a year ago. When she failed to remember to lock the screen of her phone, a message appeared on the screen. "I long for you. Tonight, at 8 o'clock. It was my brother, Ethan, who sent the message. I initially believed that I was making a mistake. This was something even Ethan, the brother whom I had helped to get out of debt and whom I had allowed to stay in our home after he went bankrupt, was unable to achieve. On the other hand, things started to fall into place after that. The events that occurred when Elizabeth traveled on business travels but never disclosed the specifics. She claimed that the little but consistent withdrawals from our joint account were for various shopping expenses, but they were actually for other things. In addition, Ethan's eyes, the manner in which he avoided staring straight at me whenever he came over, they were not confronted by me. It was unnecessary for me to do so. However, I took action. The private investigator that I hired was a man named Carl, who was of middle age and was very discreet. He asked very few questions and worked very efficiently. Carl presented me with photographs of Elizabeth and Ethan holding hands at a suburban cafe, then at a hotel, and finally at an apartment that I believe they had planned for their new life. These photographs were taken within a span of 2 months. While I was in my cramped office, I went through those photographs, each one feeling like a cut, but I didn't break down. From the suffering, I devised a strategy. I took a second look at the prenuptial agreement, which Elizabeth had signed without giving it careful consideration 25 years ago, when we were both young and she was eager to get right into married life immediately. It was once said by her that she did not care about Robert's financial situation. "I simply want to have a joyful family." That those comments would eventually become the oath that led to her downfall is a rather ironic turn of events. An infidelity clause was spelled out in the agreement in a straightforward and concise manner. In the event that one of us betrayed the other, the person who was harmed would be entitled to keep all of the assets that we had jointly acquired, including the retirement account and the house that was worth $2 million. After I had finished going over the contract, I got in touch with my attorney, Karen, who was a highly intelligent woman with eyes that seemed to see through every lie. Her statement was that Robert will make them pay, but we need to be very certain. I dug a little deeper. I found out that Elizabeth had transferred about $50,000 to a hidden account, most likely in order to provide financial assistance to Ethan, who had never learned how to fend for himself. She presented him with presents, watches, outfits, and even a sports car that he boasted about having purchased on his own. I made sure to keep record of every transaction and receipt, and I forwarded them to Karen. The evidence was like a bullet, and I was loading the chamber with each piece of evidence. I was sitting in my study the night before the anniversary party, and the desk lamp was shining light on the divorce petition that had already been signed. Despite the fact that Karen had submitted it to the court that morning, I insisted that Elizabeth make the declaration on her own first. Obviously, I was right. Her passion was drama, and she delighted in being the focus of attention. During the evening, I presented her with a gray envelope that contained not only the petition for divorce, but also a copy of the financial transactions and a photograph of her and Ethan sharing a passionate kiss while riding in a car. I wanted her to open it by herself so that I could watch the expression on her face darken as she understood that I was aware of everything. The automobile came to a stop in front of the home. After turning off the engine, I sat down in the darkness for a brief period of time. My breathing slowed down, but my mind continued to race at a rapid pace. Elizabeth and Ethan were under the impression that they had triumphed, but they were unaware that the game had already begun a considerable amount of time before. I, Robert Grayson, Never play without a strategy. After opening the entrance to the house, I made my way into my study, where the desk lighting illuminated the previous photographs that were displayed on the shelf. One of them depicted Elizabeth and I at our wedding, with her beaming smile while wearing a white dress, and me, with jet black hair, staring at her as if she were the entire universe. Another photograph was taken of Daniel when he was 3 years old, sitting on my shoulders and smiling from ear to ear as we were near the water. When I looked back on those moments, I could only see what I had given up despite the fact that they had once meant everything to me. I managed to keep my dream a secret from everyone. When I was younger, I had the dream of launching a technology firm that would concentrate on sustainable energy. I had plans, designs, and even an investor who was willing to fund anything that I had. After that, however, Elizabeth became pregnant with Daniel, and everything was totally different. She cried out in a panic, claiming that she was incapable of raising a child on her own and that she required my assistance. I gave a slight nod, put my goal on hold, and accepted a secure position in accounting. Within a short period of time, I told myself, following that, I will return to it. On the other hand, a few years transformed into a forever. Elizabeth had the desire to switch occupations, and she considered marketing to be her actual love. She wanted to move from teaching to marketing. I was there for her, I paid for her classes, and I took care of Daniel every evening so that she could concentrate on her studies. I put in extra hours to compensate for the fact that she was laid off from her first job. I knew that in order to pay off the loan, I would have to push myself to exhaustion, but I gritted my teeth and signed the loan when she expressed interest in purchasing a larger house. I didn't file a complaint. I cherished her. Daniel had my heart. I was under the impression that that was a man's responsibility. I was in charge of everything. To be exact, the bills. For Daniel's college expenses. I was referred to be the family's rock by Elizabeth. However, she failed to see that the rock was becoming more worn down. Every year, I watched as my dream became further and more distant. A layer of dust accumulated on the blueprints in the garage. Despite the fact that the investor from back then is now a millionaire, he has forgotten completely about me. I reassured myself that as long as my family is doing well, I will be fine. But Elizabeth was oblivious to it. She was unaware of the nights that I stayed up late, calculating every penny to make sure that Daniel would be able to attend a reputable school. For the sole reason that she stated that the family requires stability, she did not witness me declining a job offer in another country, where I could have established a more successful career. And Mom most certainly did not witness the instances in which I looked at Ethan, my irresponsible brother, and bemoaned the fact that I was always the one who had to make the sacrifice. I am currently seated here, and I'm holding the family photo quite carefully. It wasn't just the betrayal that caused the grief. The revelation that I had invested my entire life in something that was not genuine was the catalyst for this realization. Despite the fact that Elizabeth and Ethan believed they had stolen everything away from me, they failed to remember one thing. A rock is strong and difficult to shatter. In addition, when it rolls, it obliterates anything that is in its way. I made my way back to the living room and fell into the recliner, sitting there. Even though the clock showed midnight, I was not feeling sleepy. Elizabeth received the gray envelope that I had presented to her at the party. At this point, she must have read it, and I was aware that she would show up. Not only did she enjoy making a scene, but she really enjoyed doing it when she was cornered. First, I took a sip of whiskey, and then I waited as the astringent flavor made its way down my throat. Sharp as a scream, the doorbell could be heard ringing. With her hair untidy, her eyes red and swollen, and the crumpled envelope in her palm, Elizabeth stormed into the room unexpectedly. Although Ethan was hiding behind her with his head lowered, I noticed that his palm was squeezed as if he was attempting to stifle a tremor. Suddenly, Elizabeth yelled at Robert, "I don't even know what this is," holding out the petition for divorce. She attempted to seem defiant despite the fact that her voice was quivering. "You believe that you can destroy me?" Initially, I did not respond to anyone. I gazed at her, the woman I had once loved without question, the one for whom I had given up every desire in order to ensure that she was content. After that, I turned my attention to Ethan, The brother whom I had previously considered a member of my family, but who was now merely a coward hiding behind his lover. I gently got to my feet, allowing the silence to have an effect on them. A ruin? I remarked, my tone being low but piercing. Elizabeth, you are the one who caused that to yourself. Ethan and you both. While taking a half-step backward, she blinked her eyes. You were aware of it? Her voice was shaking, but I continued to speak. When I opened the drawer, I found a stack of paperwork, including photographs, receipts, and messages. I was throwing them onto the table, and each sheet fell to the ground like a javelin. We used the money from our joint account to purchase the sports car you bought for Ethan, the condominium in the suburbs, the hotel on Maple Road, and the sports car. Did you believe that I was unsighted? Ethan attempted to speak, but he was unable to produce any words. His eyes went into a frenzy as he glanced at Elizabeth. Liz, you mentioned that nobody was aware of it. I was on the verge of laughing. He's stuttering. Not even a single one of their lies had been coordinated. With a furious look in her eyes, Elizabeth shifted her attention to see him. Stay quiet, Ethan. He's trying to fool you. Are you bluffing? After taking a few steps forward, I pointed at the paperwork. Elizabeth, the prenuptial agreement, the infidelity provision, you will lose everything, including the house, the money, and everything else. Ethan, I turned my attention to him. Do you really believe that you could make a comfortable living off of the money that your sister-in-law gives you? Your credit score is currently in the negative because the lease was never signed. Elizabeth's countenance became pale, and her hands began to shake. Ethan appeared to be ready to run away as he retreated. She murmured to Robert, "For the sake of Daniel, we can talk." My voice was icy as I cut her off, telling her not to pull my son into this situation. Rather than me, you betrayed him. Now is the time to leave my residence. In silence, they stood there like two statues that had been shattered. After that, Elizabeth turned around and drew Ethan closer to the entrance. The sound of the door slamming as it was shut reverberated throughout the peaceful home. When I sat back down, I continued to hold the whiskey but refrained from drinking it. This had been a victory for me. But the most significant conflict in court was just getting started. The time had come for the new day to begin, and the sunlight that was coming in through the window was giving the coffee cup that I was holding a golden glow. Despite the fact that Elizabeth and Ethan had left, I was unable to sleep last night. I was no longer angry about that. I had moved on from it, because I was aware that the days that were to come would not be simple. At that moment, the doorbell rang, and when I opened it, there was Daniel, my son, standing there. His eyes were red, but his jaws were set, as if he were prepared to face the world. Daniel said to his father, "I know everything," with a hoarse but forceful tone in his voice. It is my regret that I did not notice it sooner. He came in and gave me a hug, and it was so tight that I could feel the misery he was experiencing. Daniel, who had been a child when I carried him on my shoulders, had grown into an adult and made the decision to support me. After a brief pause, he shook his head and said, "Mom and Uncle Ethan, it's hard for me to believe, yet I'm even here, Dad. I'll never leave this place." Try to contain my emotions, I gave him a shoulder pat. "It is not necessary for you to apologize, Daniel. You have my utmost admiration." While we were seated, I informed him, not to brag, but because I believed that he was deserving of the truth. With regard to the months that I spent discreetly gathering evidence concerning the prenuptial agreement and regarding my plan. In spite of the fact that he occasionally clenched his fists, Daniel did not interrupt the speaker. The only thing he said to me when I had finished was, "Dad, you did the right thing. They do not merit your presence." As the afternoon progressed, an old acquaintance named Mark stopped by. It was Mark, the honest type, who had told me about Ethan 2 years ago when he observed him staying too near to Elizabeth. Mark was the one who had warned me about Ethan. In the process of offering me a beer, Mark said, "I told you, Rob. Despite the fact that your brother was never trustworthy, I was not expecting Liz." The man came to a halt and shook his head. "You're not the only one. You can count on me, my wife, and a few other people to have your back. Simply utter the word if there is anything you require." Both the words of Mark and the hug that Daniel gave were like a burst of power. In this place, I was no longer a man who lived by myself. It wasn't the family I had always imagined I had. Rather, it was the people who had made the decision to be my family. And when I looked out the window, I noticed that the sunlight was falling on the ancient oak tree, and I realized that I wasn't only fighting for justice. I was battling for myself, for Daniel, and for Mark all at the same time. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had hurriedly rented a modest apartment after our altercation with each other. It was a far cry from the new life she had dreamed of, to be living in such a confined apartment that was littered with boxes. The stack of documents that I had given her was still sitting on the table, with each page appearing to be an accusation. Ethan sat opposite her, his hair untidy and his eyes ringed with black circles. He was looking serious. The clandestine kisses and passionate glances would no longer be exchanged. Speculation was the only thing that left. "You stated that no one knew," Ethan yelled out in a high-pitched voice that was nearly frantic-looking. "It was your assertion that the account was secure and that we could begin again. What should we do now? This terrible contract, along with images and communications, are all in Robert's possession." On the table, Elizabeth slammed her fist down, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Don't put the responsibility on me, Ethan. Do you assume that I desired this? It was you who insisted on receiving additional money, gifts, and that silly car over and over again." And she stood there, pointing at him. "As a result of your carelessness, Robert would not have been able to discover the truth. I was not present, but I was aware of how this scene played out. The fact that Carl, my investigator, was still following them was reported in a quick phone call that he made. Elizabeth and Ethan were tearing each other apart, which was exactly what I had anticipated would happen. A little element that I had hidden in the records was a transaction that Elizabeth had not disclosed to Ethan. It was $10,000 that she had kept for herself without sharing it with anyone else. Ethan's confidence was completely destroyed when he found out about it. "I thought you were going to leave me behind, didn't you?" Carl recounts that he yelled at the person. As soon as Ethan found out that the apartment they had intended to rent together had been canceled, the tension between them increased greatly. As I had mentioned earlier, his credit was in a terrible state. This was something that Elizabeth, who is used to me taking care of the finances, had not anticipated. While pounding the wall, Ethan shouted out to Liz, "We have nothing of value. We have no home, no money, and our reputations have been ruined as a result." With her hands covering her face, Elizabeth settled comfortably into a chair. She was aware that I was correct. She had lost the support of her family, friends, and other individuals who had previously admired her. The fact that the treachery had occurred spread like wildfire, a fire that I had started. She was the one on whom Ethan had relied, and he began collecting his belongings. He mumbled, "I'm done," without turning his head back. In the meantime, I appeared to be smiling as I sat in my office and listened to Carl's report. There was no need for me to make any effort. I wasn't finished with them, even though they were destroying each other. During the impending court session, the final blow would be delivered. After some time had passed, I found myself in the courtroom, where I was seated in the front row with my hands resting on my thighs and my eyes fixed on the jury. The air was chilly, and at the same time, it carried the aroma of ancient wood and paperwork. Karen, my attorney, was sitting next to me with a large stack of paperwork in front of her. Each page contained a bullet that I had crafted over the course of several months. On the other side of the room, Elizabeth sat with her eyes bent downward, her hair carefully tied, but she was unable to conceal her shabby appearance. There was no sign of Ethan. It was either that he lacked the fortitude or that he had lost his relevance. It didn't matter to me. The dossier was flipped through by the judge, who was a woman of middle age with eyes as sharp as razors. The tone of her voice was even but authoritative when she addressed Mr. Grayson and Mrs. Grayson. "In today's meeting, we will discuss the petition for divorce, as well as the distribution of assets." As she stood there, Karen's voice was crystal clear and cut through the air like a razor. "Dear Honor, we respectfully urge that the prenuptial agreement, and more specifically the infidelity clause, be subject to legal enforcement. We have proof that cannot be refuted that Mrs. Grayson committed the infraction." As Karen presented the case, I listened attentively as each piece of evidence, including photographs of Elizabeth and Ethan, text messages, and financial transactions landed like a punch as it was presented. Her words gradually chipped away at Elizabeth's appearance of composure, and she continued to do so. Although Elizabeth made an effort to keep her head held high, her eyes quickly averted and her lips pulled together into a narrow line. An ineffective argument was delivered by her attorney, a young man who appeared to be in a state of flusteredness. But there was a lack of conviction. A noose had been slung around Elizabeth's neck in the form of the prenuptial agreement, which she had signed without doing so with due consideration 25 years ago. The judge gave a slight nod before going to the last page. Her declaration was that this arrangement continues to be legally binding. Clearly, the infidelity clause is included. This means that you, Mrs. Grayson, will no longer be the owner of the marital house or the bulk of the assets that are jointly owned. The joint accounts are going to be put on hold. During this time, you will only be able to access your personal account. Her tone was icy and devoid of any form of compassion. Although Elizabeth blinked and clenched her fists tightly around the chair, she did not utter a single word. Rather than looking at her with happiness, I felt a void in my heart as I did so. The victory was not as satisfying as I had anticipated it to be. During our departure from the courtroom, Karen offered me a kind pat on the shoulder. "The first step is finished," she said, Robert. "In the end, the hearing will be nothing more than a formality." My mind was already on what was going to happen next, but I nodded my head. It's not vengeance. It's a fresh start. Once the hearing was over, Elizabeth stood in front of a mirror in her claustrophobic apartment, her eyes void of any expression. In addition to the fact that the money in her personal account would barely be sufficient to keep her alive for a few months, she had lost her reputation, which was something she had always taken great pride in. A number of her friends, who had previously admired her extravagant parties, have suddenly avoided her. Her relatives, particularly her sister, labeled her a traitor and severed all communication with her. The rumors that she was having an affair with Ethan spread across the town like a wildfire that could not be stopped. Her attempt to call Ethan was unsuccessful because his number was disconnected. While all was going on, Ethan was stumbling around at a low-cost motel on the outskirts of the city. The sports car and the outfits that Elizabeth had purchased for him were no longer in his possession. As I had mentioned earlier, his credit was a complete and utter failure, and nobody was ready to assist him. He made an effort to get in touch with former pals, but they declined his advances. This was partially due to embarrassment, and furthermore, they were aware that he had been living off of Elizabeth. I received a lengthy and frantic text from him. "Yes, I was mistaken, brother. Talk to me, if you please." Then, after reading it, I erased it. My brother was no longer under his care. It was stated by Carl, my investigator, that Elizabeth and Ethan had stopped talking with one another. Whatever was left between them was completely obliterated by their final argument, which took place immediately after the preliminary hearing. While Elizabeth wailed and referred to him as a mistake, Ethan said that she had dragged him into the muck. When they parted ways, it was not with rage that they did so, but rather with the grief that comes from having lost everything. In the meantime, I was sitting in my office in order to examine the initial blueprint for my technology company. During his call, Daniel asked about my plans, his voice brimming with excitement. Mark sent me a text message inviting me to join his family for supper. I had no longer been by myself. As I picked up a pen to draw the dream that had formerly gathered dust, I realized that I was genuinely living for the first time in years. Elizabeth and Ethan may have taken 25 years of my life, but they could not steal my future. I knew this for the first time in years. After a few weeks had passed, I decided to rent a modest office that was light and had windows that looked out into a busy street. One of the initial blueprints for my technology firm, Grayson Energy, which is focused on renewable energy, was sitting on the desk. It was now that the lines that I had drawn more than 20 years earlier came back to life, and they were no longer collecting dust in the garage. At every single stroke of the pen, a declaration was made. Not only was I surviving, but I was actually living. Things were difficult in the beginning. After staying up late, I made calls to potential investors and presented my ideas to those who had previously laughed at my goal. On the other hand, a local startup company agreed to collaborate with me after being persuaded by my proposal for solar panels that are affordable. After only 3 months, the first contract was signed, followed by a second and then a third one. It wasn't a lot of money at the moment, but it was enough to make it possible to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I had forgotten the beat of my own pulse for a very long time, yet I was able to feel it every morning when I entered the office. On a regular basis, Daniel would visit over, bringing with him both coffee and jokes. "Dad," he murmured at one point, his eyes gleaming. "I've never seen you behave in such a manner before, almost as if you were liberated." As I patted his shoulder, I smiled at him. Free. There was no other word for it. Elizabeth was no longer a burden on him, and Ethan was no longer a shadow hanging over him. For them, it was just me and the fantasy that I had reserved for them. Mark and his wife Lisa were also of great assistance. My clients were introduced to me, I was invited to meals, and I was reminded that I was not the only one involved. When I was sitting in their lawn one evening, watching their children run around, I suddenly became aware that I was no longer experiencing any discomfort. Despite the fact that the wound was still present, the bleeding had ceased. I had not only reconstructed a family, but also a life. This is my life. I worked, I learned, and I grew it every single day. When I hired 2 young engineers, they referred to me as their boss with affection. My position as someone's rock had changed. As Robert Grayson, I was a man who was working hard to make his goal come true. In addition, as I looked out the window and saw the sunlight shining down on the city, I realized that I had once again rediscovered myself. A short amount of time passed, and the last court hearing eventually arrived. On that particular day, the courtroom did not have the same level of tension as it had in the past. While I sat there with Karen by my side, the stack of documents had become nothing more than a formality. On the other side of me, Elizabeth sat, looking thinner and with tired eyes. She had stopped putting up a fight. She did not have a young lawyer who was agitated by her side. Her appearance was one of solitude, as if she had conceded defeat. As she went over the material, the judge maintained a steady tone of voice. The prenuptial agreement and the information that was provided led to the conclusion that Mr. Grayson should be given ownership of the marital house, the retirement account, and the majority of the assets that were commonly owned by both parties. An appeal is not within Mrs. Grayson's legal rights. At the conclusion of 25 years of marriage, every last word that she uttered was a period. However, Elizabeth did not utter a single word as she dropped her head and clenched her hands. Following the conclusion of the hearing, she rose up and came up to me. "Robert," her voice was soft and hardly audible above a whisper. "I was wrong, and I apologize for all that has happened to Daniel. Can we?" She began to stutter, her eyes pleading with her. I gazed at her, the lady I had loved in the past, and loved so much that I had given up all for her. But at this moment, I only saw a stranger. As I spoke to Elizabeth, my tone remained calm. "While Daniel will be all right, you and I have reached our conclusion." I walked away without turning around and did not glance back. Karen gently caressed my shoulder and whispered, "You did an excellent job." In the midst of the dazzling sunlight that was hitting my face, I nodded and stepped out of the courthouse. I inhaled deeply and began to feel a sense of relief sweep throughout my body. Not because I had won, but rather because I had liberated myself from my confinement. Elizabeth departed with the burden of a severely damaged reputation and a financial account that had been completely exhausted. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what she did since I didn't know what she would do. Daniel Grayson energy and a fresh start were presented to me. As soon as I got into my car, I realized that the previous chapter had come to an end and that the next one would be written by my own hand. After a period of 6 months, I found myself standing on a little platform in front of a gathering of young business people. Following the recent signing of a significant contract between Grayson Energy and an energy firm, I was extended an invitation to share my story. The moment I turned my head to look at the crowd, I noticed Daniel in the front row, beaming with pride. I spoke in a quiet but firm tone. There was a time when I believed that my life was over. On the other hand, I discovered that regardless of what you lose, you can always rebuild better, and stronger. My business had grown to the point where it had 10 staff, an expanded office, and plans to build a small factory. I stopped working in order to maintain someone else's happiness or to pay off obligations. I worked because I wanted to, because each solar panel that we installed was a bit of the goal that I had put aside at one point in time. There was money, but it was not the thing that I treasure the most. I will always remember the look that sprang in Daniel's eyes as he told his father, "Dad, I am proud of you." I began serving as a mentor to other males who were going through various family issues. As I listened to them, I told them my story and reminded them that they were not the source of their suffering. A man told me, "Robert, you have convinced me that I have the ability to begin again." As I patted his shoulder, I smiled at him. "So get started.